Good morning and welcome to Grand Rounds. And thank you to the hearty, smaller group that made it here on time today, despite the weather. I suspect we'll be seeing a number of people wandering in over the first 5 to 10 minutes and maybe for the whole hour. But Dr. Cavalier assures me that wherever he goes, he brings a snowstorm, and he's used to talking to audiences of 2 to 3 people. So thank you for your patience, Luke. For those that are interested, we are actually going to be audio and videotaping this presentation today, so it will be available in its entirety for those that may miss the first half. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Luc Lecavalier. Dr. Lecavalier is an associate professor of psychiatry and psychology at The Ohio State University and director of the Child Behavioral Support Services and a clinical psychologist at the Nisonger Center in Columbus. Dr. Lecavalier received his Ph.D. from the Université I'm going to really screw this one up, but du Québec at Montreal in 2001, and he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Development and Learning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research is in the area of the diagnosis and treatment of behavioral psychiatric problems in individuals with intellectual disability and/or autism spectrum disorders. He's authored or co-authored more than 60 scholarly presentations, according to his biosketch, more like 100 according to his vita. And in 2008 was the recipient of both the American Psychological Association's Division 33 and the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Early Career Awards. He's the local PI for an NIMH grant entitled Toward Outcome Measurement of Anxiety in Youth with Autism Spectrum Disorders, which runs from this year through 2016, and for a randomized trial of parent training in young children with autism, which runs 2010 to 2014. He's been co-PI or co-I in a number of other grants, including a recently completed NIMH study of atomoxetine, placebo, and parent training in autism, and other grants from the Ohio Department of Mental Health, the Battelle Endowment for Technology and Human Affairs, Access for Persons with Disabilities, and the Franklin County Board of Developmental Disabilities, among others. Dr. Lecavalier is taught at the undergraduate and graduate levels and served on a number of thesis and dissertation committees. He is Associate Editor of Autism International's Journal of Research and Practice, and a member of several editorial boards, including the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. Today's lecture, as well, is the first in what we hope will be an annual series of endowed lectureships in the area of intellectual and developmental disabilities, supported by a gift from the Alhambra Institute for Mental Retardation Research. The Alhambra lecture joins others within our Grand Round series, now about 16 annual named lectureships, which have so enriched our Grand Round series. So I want to invite all of you as well to join us after today's lecture for a special reception for Dr. Lecavalier on the 13th floor in the Chairman's Conference Room. And with that, let me please have you join me in welcoming Dr. Lecavalier.
All right. So is the microphone connected? Yeah, great. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks for braving the snow. It feels like home. I grew up in Quebec and just love the snow. Lots less of it in Columbus, as you know. So it's actually great to be here. I drove in last night, took a walk, checked out the funky architecture, had a nice meal at the Albatross. It's really nice to be here. This is a Nisonger Center. It's what we call a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Each state has at least one. Ohio actually has 2. There's another one in Cincinnati. And these centers started in late 60s because of John F. Kennedy's leadership. And the mission is to provide services, clinical services, training, and research to folks with developmental disabilities. There are about 120 employees in the center and 11 PIs from different disciplines, including pediatrics, psychiatry, and psychology, and I'm one of those people. And this is what it looks like. There's a lot of construction, and so it's not as pretty as what you see on the slide. This is what I promised not to do today. So I'm going to try to entertain you while sharing some clinical information and relevant scientific information. I want to focus on clinical management. Before we do so, we have to talk about the phenotype. We need to know what we're treating, so we'll talk about that as well. This is a slide that I downloaded from National Institute of Health website. The Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee recently published a document called the Global Landscape of Autism Research. And what you see on this slide here is the actual number of scientific publications in the field of autism, which is the blue line, compared to the number of publications from related journal subject categories. From 1980 to 2010. The first box is when NIH doubled their budget for autism research. So needless to say, autism is a hot topic. This is a breakdown of that in terms of the 7 priority areas that the government has put forward. So we have biology, treatment, intervention, risk factors, and diagnosis as the top 4 areas in terms of number of publications, and these are the areas that we'll discuss today. A word on rising prevalence. Anyone who's read the newspaper or watched the CBS Evening News has heard about the rising prevalence of autism. Is it real? Is it not? Well, of course, as in any study, the definition, the methods that we use impacts the results that we get. So the best studies are those that are done prospectively on random stratified sample where you actually interview or assess the child. Unfortunately, a lot of the studies that have been published recently, including those from the CDC, don't follow those methodological guidelines, and as a result, you have increased prevalence rates. In my opinion, the best studies indicate that the prevalence is about 60 to 70 out of 10,000 kids. So in the DSM-4, if you read the text, it says that the prevalence of autistic disorder is about 5 out of 10,000. So there has been a significant increase, and why remains unclear, but there has been a loosening of the diagnostic criteria. There's greater awareness, of course, and there's what we call the diagnostic substitution as well. If you plot the number of children that have been diagnosed with mental retardation and you superimpose that regression line to the kids that have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, you see the regression lines going in opposite directions. We'd estimate that about 25% of the rise in the prevalence is due to that phenomenon of diagnostic substitution. We need longitudinal studies that would use the same diagnostic criteria in the same group of children to see if there is a true rise in the increase. So that remains to be done. So for those of you who, I won't go through all 12 diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorders, but what we need to know is that it's a behaviorally defined syndrome. No blood test that could tell us if someone has autism or not. There are 3 major behavioral domains: qualitative impairments in social interaction. So we're talking about nonverbal behaviors that are used to regulate social interactions, your ability to have friendships. We have qualitative impairments in communication, delayed speech or absence of speech, limited abilities to have conversations, or repetitive use of language, echolalia. And then the last category, the one that received the less attention from a scientific perspective, is restrictive, repetitive, and stereotype behaviors, interests, and activities. So we have 12 criteria, and the cardinal symptom is the social relatedness. So you need 2 out of 4 criteria in the social relatedness aspect, 1 out of 4 in terms of the communication, and 1 out of 4 in terms of the repetitive, restrictive behaviors and interests. So the criteria so there are 3 subtypes to autism spectrum disorders. So we have autistic disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Asperger's disorder. And they share the same diagnostic criteria. We just have different mixing and matching of these criteria. So folks with Asperger's disorder are supposed to have qualitative impairments in social relatedness and restrictive, repetitive, and stereotype behaviors and interests, but no delays in communication. And then kids with PDD-NOS have impairments in social relatedness and something else, and that something else is not specified. So it's actually harder than it looks to find diagnostic criteria that will be accurate across the range of kids that are out there. There's tremendous heterogeneity in terms of intelligence, in terms of language. Then we have people from different ages that we're trying to accurately classify as having a disorder or not. And that's one reason why experts don't agree on the presence of subtypes. So what we've learned is that the diagnostic criteria perform quite well for classic autism. So school-age child with mild to moderate intellectual disability, we're pretty good at saying if they have autistic disorder or not. Where we're not as good is with the younger kids, and that's a paradox because the whole idea is to try to identify these kids as early as possible so we could use neuroplasticity, intervene quickly, and change the course of the disorder. And I listed a few examples on these slides here that are difficult to evaluate in very young children. Then when we talk about the subtypes, it opens up a whole new can of worms. A lot of people aren't even sure that Asperger's disorder exists. There have been some smart people that have claimed that the cases that Hans Asperger first described in 1944 wouldn't even meet the current criteria for Asperger's disorder. I, for one, very rarely diagnose Asperger's disorder. And there have been recent studies that have shown that the best predictor of subtype classification is site or geography. And not necessarily your performance on these standardized measures of cognitive functioning, language functioning, and autistic symptomatology. Now, PDD-NOS represents more than 50% of kids on the spectrum. Now, think about that for 1 second. So the residual category explains more than half of the kids in these well-done epidemiological samples, and it's used in different circumstances. I remember this study that looked at expert agreement in terms of PDD-NOS, and the kappa coefficient was 0.18. So it was just absolutely horrible. These coefficients vary from 0, no agreement, to 1, perfect agreement. And these are experts. These are people that have more than 20 years experience diagnosing ASDs, and they can't agree on the presence of PDD-NOS or not. Where we are good is saying if someone is on the spectrum versus not on the spectrum. But when it comes to different subtypes, we're just not good. So there'll be a new sheriff in town, as you know. 4 months from now, this will be revealed in Washington in May. And here are the major changes that will be occurring. There'll be a reduction to 1 diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder, so no more subtypes. And there'll be 2 symptom clusters instead of 3. And we'll have to meet all 3 criteria that are proposed for the social communication interaction factor, and 2 out of the 4 criteria for restricted and repetitive behaviors. And then they'll include these clinical specifiers, verbal abilities, known genetic disorders, epilepsy, presence of intellectual disability, and there'll be different severity levels. So here are some of my thoughts on the DSM-5. First thing that I noticed is that there were more than 2,000 different ways to qualify for a diagnosis in DSM-4, but there'll only be 11 in DSM-5. So that'll likely increase reliability. Of course, some people are nervous that, and rightfully so, I believe, that it will decrease the number of people that are identified with higher functioning autism, or people with autism that don't have intellectual disability, and people with PDD-NOS. Now, there are at least 6 studies, to my knowledge, all with important methodological problems that have been published, of course, because the criteria haven't been released yet. So you're going through files, typically, and you're looking at who would have been classified according to both systems, but the criteria aren't the same. So they're not, of course, they're not ideal studies, but nonetheless, all studies that I've looked at suggest that the rates would decrease substantially. Of course, the DSM-5 task force says that that won't happen. Then my reflection to that is, why change the definition if you want to identify exactly the same people? So time will tell what will happen with this. And of course, there have been no studies that have been done on the implications for healthcare utilization. So my conclusion is that we have difficulty in measuring ASDs reliably, and the proposed changes in DSM-5 are likely to have a significant impact on the field. Time will tell. So I leave you with this philosophical note. Felt philosophical when I was putting these slides together. So what do we have here? Well, we have a bridge, right? What do we have here? We have a bridge. Is it the same or is it different? It's the same thing. We're just looking at it from a different angle. So you can't forget that when we're talking about diagnosis, there are different levels, and we're dealing with behaviors, but there are different levels. And this is especially true with what we know in terms of autism. And we could break down each one of these levels and show some differences between kids that are on the spectrum and kids that aren't. And I'll expand on neuroanatomy and genetics for just a brief moment. This picture, this illustration was published by David Amaral and colleagues from California, and they show the major brain regions that are thought to be associated with autism, with the dysfunctions involved in autism. And so what we see here, maybe you can't see well, but the blue area, the social impairment, is so it's associated with the frontal lobe, the temporal and the parietal cortex, also the amygdala, of course. There's several subcortical and cortical regions that are associated with deficits in communication. And then much like in OCD, we have the caudate nucleus, we have the orbifrontal cortex that's associated with problems in the repetitive behavior field. Now this is exciting, and this illustration is based on a number of lesion studies, experimental animal studies, imaging studies, so it's a collection of studies that have been published in the last 10 years. And this is exciting, but we can't forget that there's been no clear and consistent pathology that's emerged, and we can't forget that the brain is part of the body. So this might not be a neurotransmission problem. This might be the result of, the output might not be the reason why we get there. There's some smart people that suggest that this might be, that at least a third of cases of autism are inflammatory problems. And there's evidence to support that. If you look at autistic brains, you could see that there's certain neurons that are enlarged due to chronic activation. So it's not crazy to think that that might be happening. Think about other inflammatory diseases that have increased significantly in prevalence in the last 30 years. Right? Asthma has doubled in prevalence. So this is complicated, and we don't know exactly what's going on is the bottom line. We know that ASDs are highly heritable. Children that have the exact same genetic material share 60 to 90% concordance rates. More recently well-conducted studies show that the rate is closer to 60%. So this suggests that the environment plays a much bigger role than what we initially thought. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term broader phenotype, it means that family members of children with autism have more cognitive rigidities, have more anxiety problems, more social problems. They're at increased risk of having OCD and other problems that are similar to autism. So there's a lot of evidence that supports that this is highly heritable. And I show this figure here to illustrate a point. So we have the largest chromosome, chromosome 1, down to chromosome, let's see, how does this go down to chromosome 22? And the red and the yellow areas are de novo losses and gains, respectively. And then we have the green areas that represent areas where genes are that modulate the risk of having an autism spectrum disorder. Then you have the red area that suggests certain areas that are probable gene candidates might be found. Now this was published 4 years ago, so it's already out of date. But the idea here is that look at what we have. How does this help us? They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And if you take all the small mutations and you collapse them together, you might explain, if you're lucky, up to 20% of cases. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we've certainly moved away from the one gene, one disorder paradigm. It's much more complicated than that. There's been a recent switch from almost an exclusive focus on inherited genes controlling neurotransmitters to rare de novo copy number variants that might affect gene regulating synaptic and axonal development. And I listed a few examples here. So what I'm saying is that this starts way before the child is born. Very important. So you have autism before you're born, according to this line of research. And we've seen this in schizophrenia and other areas, so it's not that new. It might not be that new to a lot of you. Listed some maternal and obstetric risk factors here. You can see there are a lot of them, and there's some smart people that come with pretty good explanations as to why this is happening. And this is not a comprehensive review. It's just some of the factors that have been associated in the last 10 years. Thinking, well, what, immigration? Really, immigration? Why so? Well, some people think that deficiencies in vitamin D might be associated with autism. We know vitamin D is important in embryogenesis. We know it's important in brain development, immunological modulation, right? And we notice higher rates in dark-colored people that leave southern regions and migrate to the north. And this is especially important at certain moments in mom's pregnancy. So, of course, we need to experiment and look into this some more. But this is just an illustration of the ideas that are being thrown around to try to explain what's going on. Of course, it's always an interaction between the environment and genes, right? It's never one or the other. And the best example I could come up with is PKU, or, the autosomal recessive metabolic disorder, right? So you view that as being 100% genetic. The kids with this disorder, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, are lacking an enzyme that transforms an essential amino acid, tyrosine, to phenylalanine to tyrosine. And if you don't change the diet of the child, they develop seizures, and then they wind up with profound mental retardation. Of course, if you alter the diet, the problem is that this substance is found in our diet all the time, in milk and chicken, meat. But if we had a diet that was completely different, there'd be no interaction between that gene and those environmental variables, so there'd be no PKU. Right? So just a point to illustrate that it's always a combination of environmental and genetic factors, to state the obvious. So here are my conclusions with respect to etiology. So it may be the time course of brain development rather than the final product that's most disturbed in autism. There's evidence that certain risk factors that affect the maternal fetal environment may place the fetus in increased risk for autism, and environmental factors could act in concert with inherited susceptibilities or through inducing epigenetic changes. I want to move to behavior problems and dive into treatment a bit more. So when I use the term psychopathology, I'm thinking of two different things. I'm thinking of psychiatric disorders, so axis 1 disorders, right? Mood disorders, anxiety disorders. I'm thinking of behavior problems, tantrums, aggression. And that bidirectional arrow represents the relationship between the two that we don't understand well. The first thing I want to talk about is behavior problems. So if you read the text in the DSM, we talk about behavior problems as a defining clinical feature of autism. They say that these kids have higher rates of tantrums, pica, overactivity, aggression, and so on. Not diagnostic criteria, but they talk about this in the associated text. So the first question we have is, are these features part of the ASD diathesis? So in other words, are they part of autism, or are they something separate? That's important. It's very important to understand the causes of the disorder and how we treat it. And despite this being in the text that was published in 1994, there were really few studies that have been published on the prevalence of these behavior problems. So I share the results of one study that I published. It's already been 6 years ago. What was interesting about this study is that we had a very large sample. To my knowledge, it's still the largest sample that's been published on behavior problems in these kids. We had almost 500 kids that were recruited from all over Ohio, from different geographies, and we had the parents and the teachers complete a standardized behavior rating scale with 66 behavior problems, and the figures that you see in parentheses here are moderate and severe problems as reported by parents and teachers, and these are just examples of some symptoms of ADHD, of anxiety, and self-injurious behavior and destruction of property. So the rates are really high. By the way, you're not supposed to diagnose ADHD if the child has an autism spectrum disorder according to DSM guidelines. That should change, but you can see that not every child has ADHD, so suppose that it's redundant by putting that restriction. Here are two other facts I want you to think about. You will deal as psychiatrists with people who have autism spectrum disorders, or something that we call autism spectrum disorders, whatever it is. So in this study we did here, we had a large sample. We had 353 children, and we asked the parents to report the medicines that had been taken in the last year. The average age of our sample was 9 years old, and about half of the sample had taken at least one psychotropic medicine in the previous year. A quarter of the sample had taken several psychotropic medicines. We had stimulants, antidepressants, and antipsychotics at the top of the list. There were many children that were taking alternative treatments, these crazy vitamin regimens, for instance, in concert with psychotropic meds. We also looked at caregiver stress. And I share this because the point I want to make is that these problems are prevalent, we need to treat them, and you're dealing with the parents. It took me about 10 years being a clinical psychologist to realize that even though I thought of myself as a child psychologist, I dealt with parents all the time. And you're dealing with people that are highly stressed. Look at the rate that we found here. We found 57% of the mothers that participated in their study had clinically elevated levels of stress. That's 6 times higher than what we would expect based on a normal distribution. And what we found is that it wasn't the IQ of the child, it wasn't socioeconomic status, it wasn't size, it wasn't gender, it was the behavior problems. It wasn't the severity of autism, it was the behavior problems, it was the externalized behavior problems that were associated with caregiver stress. This was true for parents and teachers. And we tracked part of the sample for a year. And like a toothache, what we found out is that the behavior problems don't magically disappear. They get worse. And our models had some support for a transactional model. So in other words, you have the snowball effect. You have the behavior problems get worse. That exacerbates the stress. And then as stress gets worse, the behavior problems get worse as well. So it's really important to treat these behavior problems, know how to deal with these parents. So I'm moving away from the behavior problems to the DSM defined disorders. And I apologize if this is small. This is a book chapter that's in press, and I thought it would be interesting to see the different samples and the different rates that have been reported when investigators have used structured interviews to measure psychiatric problems in kids with autism. What we notice here is that more than 70% of them meet criteria for at least one disorder, and anxiety disorders and disruptive behavior disorders are very prevalent in this population. We don't have data like this. This is a slide that I stole from colleagues that worked in the MTA, the multimodal treatment of ADHD. For those of you that aren't aware of this study, you should be. But it's the largest treatment study in the field of ADHD. We had 579 kids that were randomized to one of 4 conditions. We had behavior management, medicine and behavior management, and treatment as usual. And the point I want to make here is that you don't just get kids. The criteria was ADHD, but look at the comorbidity picture here. You have about 1/3 of the kids that had ADHD alone, but most of the kids had something else going on. And I suspect it's very similar with autism, and this is why we should think of them as the autisms. It's not just autism. And presumably, they're different etiologies, and we need to match the etiology to treatment. Right? That's the whole idea of doing this. And we don't know much about comorbidity in course when it comes to autism. And this slide here just illustrates the importance of clarifying that clinical picture. What you see here is still results from the MTA, but you see that kids responded differently to different treatments based on their pattern of comorbidity. So kids who had ADHD and anxiety did best in the behavior management only condition, and kids who had ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders, for instance, didn't do well in the combined treatment. But food for thought. So my conclusion is that there are very high rates of behavior and emotional problems in these children, and their phenomenology is in need of more refinement. Now I want to move away from the phenotype and talk about treatments. Now, no matter what it is that we're treating, the core symptoms of the disorder, social communicative behavior problems or repetitive behaviors, or associated features like anxiety and behavior problems, this field has been a magnet for fad treatments. It's just amazing. These are examples of what we see currently in one of our controlled trials. We log all the different treatments that these preschoolers are adhering to. And some of them, it's not unusual to see the parents involved in 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 different treatments. And most of these don't work, of course. And if they did, we'd know about it and we'd be doing it. A lot of them haven't been studied well, I should say. Not necessarily the ones that are on this slide, but it's important to say that absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence, of course. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we treating, right? The core features or the associated features. So when you think about the core features, you think of comprehensive early intervention packages. I want to take a moment to talk about this. This is an important study, in my opinion, that's been published. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the field, in 1987, a famous psychologist, who now is famous, Ivar Lovaas, published a paper. And he suggested that with intensive early intervention, we could change the course of the disorder to such a point that that half of the kids that were in this treatment group were no longer distinguishable from their peers. And a lot of these debates have gone on in the special ed literature, but people have strong opinions as to whether or not people should be involved in early intensive intervention. Now, there were significant problems with this study. He didn't randomize people. Anyone who's done research knows that randomization is critical. So no randomization. The outcome measures were dicey at best, but nonetheless, it was very avant-garde at the point. And since that time, there's been a lot of debate. Well, here we are 25 years later, and these authors published this review paper, and they only found 2 randomized control trials. So most of the time has been spent advocating and fighting for services instead of doing actual research. So this is not a knock on applied behavior analysis. It's just a call for more research. And what we know is that these things seem to work at a group level, but at the individual level, it's not exactly certain who responds best to this treatment. And this is true for all treatments, right? So it's all about moderation and mediation from a statistical standpoint. So the real question is not, does methylphenidate help to decrease symptoms of ADHD? Of course it does. We've known that for a while. The question is for who and under which circumstances does this work? So what we know about early intensive behavioral interventions is that responders tend to have a higher IQ. They tend to respond fairly quickly. They don't have seizures, and they develop language before the age of 5. What we don't know is the mechanism of action, why this works. We don't really know that. We don't know what the optimal dose of treatment is. We don't know what the duration should be, and we don't know what the mode of delivery should be. So there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. What we have found out with time is that good early intervention, comprehensive intervention packages start quickly, they're intense, and they're tailored to the individual's need. And then if it's a center-based program, we got to consider where we're sending the child once the study's over. If we're sending him home where there are no supports, what tends to happen is that those gains usually disappear with time. So that's something else we need to think about as clinicians and scientists. I want to take a moment to talk about the psychopharmacology of ASD. So autism is quite different than other psychiatric disorders because our drugs have not been successful at decreasing symptoms, the core symptoms, right? We could decrease overactivity, decrease hallucinations, anxiety, mood problems, but the symptoms of autism, we've had a lot of difficulty. So that might mean that we don't have the right drugs, but it might mean that it's not a neurotransmission problem as well. Now, most of the drug studies have focused on irritability as defined by aggression, screaming, tantrums, ADHD symptoms, and repetitive behaviors. Now, at this point, there are only 2 FDA drugs that are approved for the symptoms associated with autism, Abilify and Risperidone. All the other drugs are used off-label. And again, about half of the kids use at least one psychotropic drug. Now, why does this happen? And these obstacles apply to the early intensive behavior interventions as well. This is a low incidence disorder. Right? If you stop and think about it and you're looking for a child that is between the ages of 5 and 15, has autism, no seizures, or running this Abilify trial, and before you know it, your base rate is pretty low. And then you got to find people that are willing to stop their treatment, be randomized, right? So it's just hard to find the people. So you need multi-center grants, and these things are expensive. They take time. Junior faculty don't have time for this, right? They want to get promoted. They want to get tenured. So these are real challenges, and there's great genetic and phenotypic heterogeneity. And what that means is that decreases effect size, and that decreases the odds that you'll be able to replicate some of your findings. In addition to that, we have these large placebo responses in this field, the strangest thing. So there are a lot of obstacles. So if you guys agree that these are solid methodological criteria, I'll review the literature in a second. So what you have on the right-hand side here is the results of a study that was published on citalopram, Celexa, and SSRI to decrease repetitive behaviors in autism. So a lot of people take SSRIs that I see in my practice, might vary, maybe it's different in Cleveland, but in Columbus I see a lot of this. And the goal is to decrease repetitive behaviors. So if we didn't have a placebo here, if this was an open label trial, we'd conclude that 30% of the kids, these are CGI scores by week on the x-axis, and then you have the people who have a 6 or a 1 or a 2 on the CGI, so very much improve or improved, and we'd conclude that 30% of kids respond positively to citalopram, right? So you add the placebo, and then that changes the conclusion drastically. You conclude that the sugar pill is no significantly different than the active medicine. What you don't see on this slide is the adverse effects that are significantly different, especially GI problems across groups. So if we accept that these are the standards that should be used, this is my assessment of the literature. I might have missed a few studies. This tried to be comprehensive, but if you use the criteria on the previous slide and you add another criteria that says there should be at least 30 subjects, 15 per group, or else these inferential statistics make little sense. This is the state of the literature right now. So I'll expand on a few of these studies, but the bottom line is that there are not a lot of studies that are out there. The citalopram study we just talked about doesn't work. Valproic acid didn't work. The outcome variable was irritability in that study. We have nothing on benzodiazepines, if you could imagine. And most kids are following several treatments, and yet we have virtually no combined treatment studies out there. They're complicated to do, and I'll talk about the only one that's been published, to my knowledge, at this point. So I want to talk about one methylphenidate study, 2 Risperidone studies, and then I'll finish this off with a few behavioral treatments. So in this study here, this is the gold standard of the field, if you could imagine. It's a study where only 66 kids were randomized. So this is a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study. So the kids that were able to tolerate methylphenidate were assigned. I'm not a big fan of crossover studies, I'll tell you the truth. This is better than nothing, but it's sort of easy to figure out when you're on the placebo and when you're not. But in any event, so you had, the kids were randomized, so you have a week in each treatment, low, medium, and high dose, and the placebo. And the outcome measure was parent and teacher ratings of hyperactivity in the CGI. This is what we found. So the teacher ratings indicated that on the far left, you have the baseline. Notice that the people are responding, right, even when they're taking the sugar pill. A lot of them are doing better. I mean, I see this all the time. I see them in the psychosocial treatment studies as well. And the biggest effect, which is by some standards considered moderate to large effect size, was with the high dose. So we had something similar with the parent ratings. But the largest effect was found, an effect size of 0.5 was found in the medium group, right? So I'm comparing this to what is seen in typically developing kids, and the reason I'm doing this is that this is something we see with a lot of psychoactive substances in kids with autism. Higher rates of adverse effects, less positive effects. So look at the MTA is the study we talked about, typically developing kids. So look at that. So the effect sizes are significantly different across groups, as is the response rate, and then you have the opposite thing that happens with the intolerable side effects. I want to talk about the research unit in pediatric psychopharmacology autism networks. I've had the privilege to be working with these really smart people in the last decade, actually. This is a cooperative agreement that was set up by NIH, and we have the initial participants were UCLA, Johns Hopkins, Indiana, OSU, and UCLA. UCLA and Johns Hopkins dropped out, and now we have Pittsburgh and Rochester. And this study here led eventually to the FDA approving Risperidone for the treatment of irritability in autistic disorder. So it was an 8-week randomized placebo-controlled parallel group study, and the primary outcome measures were the CGI and parent ratings of irritability. These are the results. to cut to this is a super drug, folks. This is an effect size of 1.2. Doesn't get better than this, not to my knowledge, not in this field. So you can see that at baseline, the groups are similar, and then at endpoint, you have a significant difference between the groups. What you don't see here is the extension phase, where we re-randomize people, and in the discontinuation phase, if people were re-randomized to placebo, most of them decompensated, and that just goes to show that the drugs don't change the underlying pathophysiology. Right? But, I mean, you knew that, but it just goes to show what we already knew. These are the CGI responses for that study, and this is as good as it gets, really. Once you've had this, and everything else is disappointing. But notice that you still have 15% responders in the placebo group here with the CGI. So then the rationale was, wow, so we have this super drug, we have these kids that decompensate with time when we follow them up. If we take them off the drug, they don't do well. What if we added parent training and applied behavior analysis to this group? Would the effects last longer? Could we have a smaller dose of risperidone? Because I didn't show the side effects, but as you probably know, they can be significant. The most important ones are weight gain and drowsiness. So we had this parallel group design with blinded evaluations. We had 124 subjects. And the outcome variables were irritable behavior, non-compliance, adaptive behavior is measured by the Vineland, and CGI scores. So we had direct observations, we had teacher ratings as well, but this is the nuts and bolts of it. So just a word on our parent training. This took years to develop. We pilot tested it, and so we settled on this program that had 16 topics. Folks would come into the office, and they'd meet about 75 minutes a week with a Ph.D. level psychologist, and these were the sessions, the topics that were covered. Won't get into the details, but this is what it looked like, and there was a didactic component, role-playing, homework, of course, because they spend 75 minutes with the psychologist, but the rest of the week at home. And I show this slide here just to show you the size of the team. And it's amazing to think of the work, the effort, and the money that goes in running these studies. This was a 5-year project that cost millions of dollars, that required a lot of logistical coordination. If you think of the blinded evaluators, the dispensing of the medicines, the therapists, the scheduling, it's a big deal. Here are some of the results. So the HSQ, Russell Barkley, ADHD, we modified this. You have 25 different situations where we ask if the child is compliant or not, while mom is on the phone, when you're getting ready to go to school, and so on. And this is the average score on a 9-point scale. And what we see here, well, you could tell me how you feel. Not everyone on the team felt the same way about these results. With hindsight, we think that risperidone might have been too powerful of a drug to see if we could add additional benefits to it. You gotta remember, this is one drug, one sample. And I look forward in being unblinded and seeing what will happen with atomoxetine. We have a similar design, but we have a parent training group only here. This was not a head-to-head comparison. We didn't have a PT-only group. It would be too expensive and too long to recruit these people, and perhaps unethical, because a score of 25 on the aberrant behavior checklist irritability scale means that you're in bad shape. We don't know if parent training alone works or not. So the effect size here was a 0.33, if I remember correctly, far different than the 1.2 we attained with risperidone. So we concluded in the paper, so we published this in the Orange Journal, we concluded that there were significant added benefits to add PT to risperidone. That was a right thing to say, I guess. Now, what would you say if I tell you that the CGI scores were not different? Blinded evaluators did not see a difference. That's what happened. What would you say if I told you that the direct observation, so we bring him in the lab, have a two-way mirror, mom has a bug in the ear, and we tell her to give commands, and then we measure tantrums, aggression, noncompliance. What would you say if I told you those direct observations didn't show a significant difference? Would that change your conclusion? There were no differences. What would you say if I said that with time, at the 1-year follow-up, the difference between groups was attenuated by about half? Might be a statistical power issue, might not. So it's not clear. It's not clear if it's worth it, in my opinion. So you drive to the office for 16 weeks, you pay for a psychologist. do homework, change the home environment. It may or may not work for everyone. We just need more, so the moderator-mediator paper just got published, and no moderators, no mediators.
The parents were part of the evaluators?
Yes.
Who got trained?
Yes.
They were not blind?
No. So the only significant differences were found with the parent ratings, not the blinded evaluators, not the direct observations. And some of those reviewers pointed that out, and they were right. And I congratulate the Orange Journal for publishing this. This is a null result, really. It's hard to publish those in good journals. And this is not a glamorous study to publish, but we got it in there. Not easy, but we got it in there. And it's important for people to know this. We need to know what happens down the road, right? So the last thing I want to say, that leave you on, is that there have been other areas with empirical support. There are at least 3 that I could name. Social skills groups are one of them. We have a paper that we're about to submit. There have been at least 50 papers that have been published on social skills in the last 12 years. Only about 20% of them are randomized controlled trials that have at least 30 subjects if we use my criteria here. And what they show is that high-functioning kids with autism do well. Now, you got to remember, at least half of the people on the spectrum have intellectual disability, and that area hasn't been looked at carefully. Then we have the picture exchange communication system. I see this every week. I don't know about you guys, people that work in the field. So these are little icons that the kids exchange, the kids that are nonverbal, to say what they want. And it's used all over the place, all over the world, really. And people believe in this. If you look at the actual research out there, there's not that much out there. What's out there suggests that it might be beneficial, but we clearly need more research on this. And the last area of research where there has been an increase in the last 10 years is CBT for anxiety problems. These are all waitlist control groups. They show that there is some improvement in high-functioning autism, but we clearly need more research in this, and we don't know what the dose is. We don't know if this works with mood problems. We don't. All the questions that I illustrated earlier with early comprehensive behavioral interventions apply in these situations as well. Now, about 10 years ago, none of this was going on, so we've seen dramatic increases, and it's an exciting time, of course. So my conclusion here is just that we had significant amounts of treatment studies with increased methodological rigor that have seen today in the last 10 years, but more work is needed to understand the moderators and the mediators of treatment. And that's my story. And it's 8:50 on the dot. So 8:50.
Do we have questions? How odd. Okay, Dr. Hertzer, I'll be right there.
Thank you. Very informative, Luke. One of the risk factors was SSRI in first trimester. Could you enlighten us on that a little bit?
Yeah, good question. The long and short of it is we don't know. Is it what the SSRI is treating? Is this because the parents are more anxious and more likely to seek a diagnostic evaluation? Or is this the SSRI? We just don't know. And the odds ratios in those studies are about 1.2. So with these studies here, it really highlights the difference between a clinically significant result and a statistically significant result. So these are large-scale studies, large sample sizes, and then something comes up as statistically significant. What does this explain in reality? We don't know. We don't know. And it makes sense. I mean, the serotonin pathways are disturbed in autism. Some animal models of autism have shown that serotonin can lead to we could make these mice behave as autistic when we deplete certain areas of the brain. I mean, so they're plausible explanations, but we don't really know at this point. We need more research.
So thank you, that was wonderful. Exactly what I needed as a geriatric neurologist, psycholinguist, and somebody interested in narrative medicine. Now, you ended your statement by saying, this is my story. So the words in this space and the stories that are told, I think, are very important. The brain is not only embodied, but it's enculturated. And in the space that I work in, the Alzheimer's space, there's amazing changes in the lexicon and the stories that DSM-5 is promoting by getting rid of the word dementia and replacing it with major and minor neurocognitive disorders. So we're in a spectrum too. And I would say the state of our field is not dissimilar. I mean, every time you hear a talk like it, it's more research is needed. But in actual fact, it's getting tough to see whether that actually represents, forgive me for saying this, the most viable social option. I mean, maybe this is a chance to rethink what we're doing, and DSM-5 is only doing that to my degree, to my opinion, in a very limited way. So I'm trying to get to a question here. There are the space around, when you do the personalized treatments that you do, I mean, what the parents' attitudes are about autism, what people have read about Alzheimer's, what the current fad, as you call them, therapies are of the day. How much do you think that in terms of providing individual benefit to families with your condition, working with them to understand this linguistic cultural space around the words that are being used has to do with whether you get a good response or not? I'm not asking you for the data, I'm asking you for your individual perceptions. How much is this story and semantic space important?
You know, that's a great question. I agree with your statement. There have been a lot of smart people that have criticized what's going to happen with the DSM-5, as I'm sure you know. My personal opinion, based on what I've seen in the trials in the clinic, is that it's very hard to change people's opinions. And some parents walk in, I'm thinking of this parent when you ask your question, she was an oncologist, right? So she was a highly educated woman. She spent 24 weeks with me in this ongoing trial where I'm training her on behavior management, on scientific principles, on how to pick effective treatments. We finished the treatment, and I say, so, what do you have lined up? He said, yeah, I'm starting chelation next week. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. We just spent all this time talking about why this doesn't work and what you should be looking for. And I think that I use that to illustrate a point. I think that some people change their opinions, but a lot of them walk in and they've read stuff on the internet and they have their opinions, and they use their terminology and they know what they want, and that's why we call them recommendations. I'm sure all of you have, we pay the people to come in our studies and they still don't show up. These are recommendations, and a lot of people just don't follow them. And sort of a roundabout way to answer your question, but that's how I feel about this topic.
Random question is a better answer than a question.
So, Luc, just a comment. I would submit that the reason pharmacotherapy has been so unsuccessful is that virtually, in autism, that virtually none of it is mechanism-based, right? Mm-hmm. Virtually none of it is based, by that I mean, on a mechanistic understanding of what's wrong in the brain of children with autism. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think the focus needs to be if we are to think that we'll be treating this pharmacologically.
Yeah, I agree, and you have to have an idea what the mechanism of action is if you're going to get funded federally and taken seriously, but you could always make up a story. I made up a cool story about guanfacine in the last grant I submitted. I didn't get the money, but still tried. But I agree with you. I agree with you, and we need to change the way we think about this. It won't be the traditional 12 suspects that we see in most patients. It'll be something else, or it won't be a pharmacological answer.
I understand that in comparing parents of Down syndrome and parents of autism, that an important distinction is that the Down syndrome are loving and remain loving and lovable, but the autistic kids may not give love back, which can become very, very discouraging for the mother. And I wonder if my own interest is child murder by parents, and I've seen parents who've killed autistic kids. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how that element plays into parenting the failure to give love back to the mother?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'd say that I've seen a lot of kids with Down syndrome who are not lovable in my clinic. So the rates of psychopathology or externalized behavior problems is lower, and some think they have higher rates of internalized problems, and that's less disturbing. But I agree with the general stereotype that they are more friendly. I'd also counterbalance that by saying that I've seen a lot of kids with autism also give love back, of course. But I understand your question, and I think it does take a toll on mothers and fathers. And there's been a lot written on stress and hardships, financial, psychological. And more psychologists are focusing on the positive aspects of having a child with autism. So the resiliency we see in these mothers is just also mind-boggling. Another thing that I think of when you talk about this is the broader autism phenotype. So in 1943, when Connor described the disorder for the first time, he talked about these refrigerator moms, right? And he blamed it on the mothers. And now I think of the broader phenotype, and I'm thinking, man, this guy was spot on. You read that paper. Nobody reads that paper. I actually went down, found the paper, read the paper, and I'm thinking, wow, what a canny description. What he's describing is a broader phenotype, perhaps, or these mothers are more rigid and more cold. But I could see why some parents would snap, as we say, and this would go in directions that we want to avoid. I realize I'm not really answering the question, but those are thoughts on the topic.
If I can offer an alternative answer to that, I think the question, I'm over here. I think that the question should be focused in a different direction, which is, do the parents go through the appropriate grief process of having a child with a developmental disability? And it's going to be a chronic problem. It's not something that's going to go away. It's not an ear infection that 10 days of antibiotics and then you're done with it. This is something that's going to persist with you through a lifetime, your lifetime and the lifetime of the child. And there has been work done looking at the Kubler-Ross criteria, showing that in this population, as in other populations of individuals with chronic medical conditions, children who have chronic medical conditions, parents don't make it all the way. And frequently they don't make it all the way. So you have to ask yourself also on what stage they've gotten stuck when they do get stuck, and then use that as a measure to some degree to explain why they behave the way they do. Because I can take if you want to use the argument about not loving, what about children with profound, I guess I can't use the word mental retardation anymore, it's a forbidden word. I don't care, it's a stupid rule anyway. And if anyone wants to discuss it with me later on, please feel free. Because it's not terminology changes that are going to change how we view the DD population. It's education of the public, but that's a different topic. But individuals with profound cognitive impairment also don't give love back in the same way. But they don't cause trouble as much because many times they're not mobile. They can't have a lot of externalizing behavior because they don't have as much cognitive function. There's a whole bunch of different issues that are there. But even there, the parents still have issues with the grief process and get stuck in similar stages as the parents of children with autism. So it's really a much bigger picture than just something as simple of, do they love back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great comment.
We're coming up on 9 o'clock. We're going to have to stop, but please join me in thanking Dr. Lecavalier. For those who still have questions, please join us upstairs on